Okay, I think in the interest of timekeeping, we'll kick off this session. Just a very quick good morning once again to those patrons and benefactors who have joined us for this morning's session. It's our first Patrons Club webinar of the year, and this session will be on the topic of the Autumn Statement and whether it was a reset for the government. As a very quick disclaimer, the session is being recorded this morning. So on behalf of the Spanish Chamber of Commerce in the UK, I'd just like to give a very quick welcome and thank you all. Thank you especially to Signum for joining us to deliver this session. And Signum Global is a leading independent geopolitical and policy advisory, providing predictive and best-in-class research to help clients navigate a world of ever-changing political and macro uncertainty. They're one of the newer patrons of the Spanish Chamber of Commerce in the UK, and since their inception in 2018, they're now serving almost 200 firms, including an ever-growing and important Spanish base. Today we're joined by Nicholas Fitzroy, who's a senior UK and Europe analyst and partner at Global Signum Advisors. Nico has a decade of experience producing political and economic analysis, mainly for corporates and governments. He previously worked at the Economist Intelligence Unit, where he focused on political and economic forecasting and headed up the firm's business risk practice. He was also a senior political risk analyst at G4S Risk Consulting. Nico holds a Master of Science in International Relations from Bristol University, as well as a Master of Science in Psychology and a graduate diploma in economics, both from Birkbeck University of London. Following on from Nico's presentation this morning, there will be time for a Q&A session. So throughout the duration of his talk, please feel free to add any questions that you might have directly to the Q&A function below. And that's everything from me. So I'll hand over to you now, Nico. Thank you very much for joining us.
Yeah, great. Thanks for that introduction. Yeah, if we go on to the next slides and just get into the presentation. Yeah. So the autumn statement, I mean, there's always the question of how much does it really matter? I think the main kind of fiscal event for any government in the UK is inevitably the budget in March. That's the moment when governments sort of outline their fiscal plan for the year. That's the moment where they put in place the big changes that they want to make, and that's the moment where we normally see the bulk of their strategy. The autumn statement tends to be a moment where they might tweak that, they might add a few things based on the events of the last few months, but it tends to be a lesser event than the budget. So March, the budget, the autumn statement tends to be October, November, and normally just to kind of update or slightly tweak what's happening in the government strategy. In this case, I think it is particularly important, but also, I mean, if we look at last year, just to see how the autumn statement can be a really important moment. In September last year, the mini budget moment. So Liz Truss became Prime Minister in September last year. She immediately outlined plans for a kind of mini budget, an emergency budget, and Kwasi Kwarteng, her Chancellor, in that budget outlined huge tax cuts to corporation tax, to the highest rate of income tax, various other things as well, and massive spending plans. Didn't cost any of those plans, didn't want any of the independent forecasts of the Office of Budget Responsibility, and because of that, basically lost confidence from markets. There was massive bond market turmoil in the aftermath, and that triggered the potential for a financial crisis. So the autumn statement last year took place in the kind of aftermath of that crisis. Rishi Sunak was then brought in as Prime Minister, and his Chancellor, Jeremy Hunt, in November last year outlined an autumn statement, which was particularly important because it was aimed at kind of suppressing that market volatility and the threat of financial crisis. So last year was especially important in terms of financial volatility. People were looking at bond markets, and that was unusual, I think, for an autumn statement. This year is slightly different. I think the main issue this year is the political impact of the autumn statement, and compared to normal autumn statements, it has particular importance in the kind of political sphere. The reason really being that the government knows that it's probably going to hold an election in the next year, so we expect a general election in October next year. We think that's the most likely point because it is pushing January the year after is the deadline by which an election has to be held. We think the government will push that date to some degree as long as it can go, but it won't want to go all the way till January because at that point we'll be in the middle of winter and there may be a kind of health crisis that undermines its election campaign. So October seems like the most likely time for the next UK general election. And that makes this autumn statement particularly important because in order for the impact of fiscal changes to actually in order for those impacts to affect the way people vote, you need time for whatever it is, tax cuts, spending increases, to filter through into people's pockets, for them to feel richer, and for them to maybe change the way they're going to vote. So arguably, this autumn statement is more important than the March budget coming up because it gives a year for the government to put in place plans that maybe win back voters. And for the government, I mean, I've outlined here 4 reasons why that is necessary. But for the government, that's particularly important because for 4 reasons. But firstly, because the government's poll numbers remain very, very poor. At the moment, the Conservative government is averaging, the Conservatives are averaging around 24, 25% in the polls, some slightly more, some slightly less. But even in the most optimistic polls, they're looking at a very, very significant electoral defeat, probably the loss of 100, 200, maybe even 300 seats, depending on which polls you're looking at the moment. So the poll numbers suggest a big defeat. And I think for the government, this statement is important for the poll numbers because those poll numbers haven't really moved. On average, even in the aftermath of that kind of chaotic Liz Truss government, Rishi Sunak took over. From the moment he took over to now, his party standing in the polls is basically about the same. So he's had a year in which to change, the dynamics, change voters' preferences, and he's failed to do that up till now. And that's a big deal for the government because the longer voters say they're not going to vote for a party, the more likely it is that they're not going to vote for a party. If voter preferences are very volatile, then it can maybe be assumed that the negative outlook is maybe a short-lived thing, and maybe the government can still get on top of a rise in polling. That kind of upward swing in the volatility is something they could capitalize on. At the moment, for the government, they haven't got that, and so the fear is that the votes against them are becoming cemented. Those opinions are becoming cemented, and therefore it becomes harder and harder over time to actually change the way people are going to vote. And if we look at the last year, Rishi Sunak, the Prime Minister, has managed to see an uptick in polling in a very minor way on maybe 2 occasions. In March, there was the Windsor Agreement with the EU, which in theory resolved one of the main trade issues remaining after Brexit in Northern Ireland. That led to a slight uptick in his polling and the party's polling. And then more recently, he announced the watering down of some of the net zero policies that his government was attached to. And that also led to a slight uptick. But neither of those things have notably affected what would be the outcome of the election. So the government at this point really needs something to do that. And that's what makes this autumn statement so important, because this is a kind of key set piece for it to potentially be able to do that. The other points here are also important. One is that the government has continually tried to implement resets. So because of this negative polling outlook, they've tried to, in various set pieces, tried to say, this is the moment where everything changes, and it hasn't changed. It hasn't been reflected in the polling numbers. One of those would be the Conservative conference at the beginning of October, where Rishi Sunak tried to separate himself from the previous leaders of his party, tried to talk about his new vision for a long-term future. That hasn't really cut through because the cost of living crisis in the UK is still very significant. Living standards are still in real terms falling. And so the idea of him talking about, 5-10-year plans seems a bit abstract, hasn't cut through. That reset's been ditched. The next reset is this autumn statement and what's in it. So therefore, it's very important for that reason as well, because there's only so many times a party and a government can say this is the real reset, this is the moment. If that continues to fail, again, it's a bit like the polling issue. They lose value and meaning the more you do, and so there's only so many you can do, basically. And a third really important point here is that the Conservative Party is at the moment really riven with serious divisions, particularly over immigration policy. So the government's plan on immigration was to basically deport asylum seekers and undocumented migrants who are crossing the channel from France in small boats, deport them to Rwanda and have them processed in Rwanda. That has been struck down. That plan's been struck down by the Supreme Court as of last week. And that means that, one of the key issues for their voters, their core voters, at the moment looks like something they're unable to resolve. And that's leading to big divisions within the party, and actually has led to a loss of confidence. For Rishi Sunak, the Prime Minister, has looked, a lot of MPs, of his own MPs, have actually lost confidence in him. Well, I say a lot, it's still a small number, but some have lost confidence in him. This is a moment for him to try and reset that. So not only for the voters, but also within his own party, this is also really important. And the last point explains why. Basically, the party is very divided over a whole range of different things. Almost every policy, there are divisions within the party. The one thing that Conservative MPs are united over is that they need to cut taxes, and they want to cut taxes. And any tax cut that's put forward has a greater chance of united approval within the party than basically any other policy. So the Autumn Statement and the chance to maybe cut taxes is a kind of key moment to reunite the party. Those are the reasons why it matters. Very important politically this year, in the way last year it was important financially. Can we have the next slide, please? Thanks. So that leads me on to what was in the Autumn Statement and what wasn't in it. I think what wasn't in it is also probably maybe just as important. What was in it, there were a number of things that were in it. I think the key here is that the government has tried to target both business and to show that it is trying to reinvigorate growth. Economic growth is likely to be the kind of key feature of the UK election next year. That's the thing the Labour Party is saying they will depend on for most of their fiscal policy. The government also trying to compete on that front. So economic growth, and therefore the kind of boost of businesses and investment, is one of the things that the government's targeted here. And then obviously voters and trying to win back support. The way it's done that really is through two things. One, there's a whole range of things in the Autumn Statement, but I think the two most important things on that front. One is the permanent extension of capital allowances for companies. So what's called full expensing of machinery and capital equipment, basically for them up to every £1 million that companies spend on machinery and capital equipment, $250,000 of that gets deducted from their profits, and therefore they have to pay less tax. So it's a tax break based on investing in capital and in machinery. That's something that businesses have been calling for and have said would increase their investment. But at the moment, it was before the Autumn Statement, it was only a 3-year horizon. The government's extended that permanently, so that's now permanent. And I think that is, that's been widely received pretty well. I think it's something that should increase investment. The certainty around having that over the long term should increase investment. And the government increased corporation tax recently. This is maybe one way for certain businesses that rely on machinery and capital equipment. This is a good tax break to kind of counter that increase in corporation tax. The other main thing that government has done here, the kind of rabbit in the hat, is the expression that policymakers tend to use, was that it cut national insurance tax on workers from 10% to 12% down to 10%, which is an important change, I think. Other things that it's done, it's cut what's called the Class 2 national insurance tax for the self-employed. So there's also a tax cut for self-employed workers. And there's been a big reform of unemployment benefits, which I'll maybe go into a little bit in a minute. Those would be the big four takeaways. Those are the most impactful things, I think, both in terms of potential support and also in terms of business and investment support as well. Importantly, given that this is a very political Autumn Statement, it's important to see what wasn't in there. The government, after the Truss affair and that kind of mini budget crisis last year, the government has been very careful to roll out in the news beforehand everything that it might end up putting into place in the Autumn Statement, and the Autumn Statement last year as well, it did the same. Two of the things it rolled out were a cut to inheritance tax and also lifting the threshold for stamp duty, so the tax paid on earnings from property sales. Those were two things that would have targeted very, very specifically Tory Conservative voters, because Conservative voters are more likely to own a home, and they are typically, richer people tend to vote Conservative, and richer people tend to be the ones that pay inheritance tax. It's interesting that the government hasn't focused on either of those things. So it hasn't focused narrowly on things that would have really benefited the kind of small number of its very core supporters. Instead, it's tried to get as broad a support base as possible from this autumn statement, and that's probably a positive, because that means it genuinely is looking at the economy as a whole rather than overly specifically at a small subset of voters. Clearly, the government here is trying to win support, but it's not overly focused on winning support. There's still a bigger strategy, I think, that does affect the economy, so that's a positive. Can we have the next slide, please? Thank you. So I guess the question now, based on that, is this, how positive will this be for the economy? I think there are two things here that definitely can be seen as positive for the economy. I've already explained why that permanent full expensing of the capital allowance for machinery and capital equipment, that is definitely a positive. That was something that had been called for by various businesses and particularly in industry, obviously, because it's to do with physical capital. I think that's something that will provide a boost, and I think that's supported clearly by the Office of Budget Responsibility, which has said that this will provide a boost to business investment going forward. So economic forecasters are built in now that this will provide an investment boost, and also by the fact that the Labour Party, so Rachel Reeves, the shadow chancellor, said yesterday, she tried to lay claim to this and said this is something Labour have been pushing the whole time, and also said that she supported it and thought it was a good idea. Given that she was basically trying to attack the government on everything else she could, that's a sign that this is something that is broadly very popular. And I think that it's popular for a good reason. I think this will have a positive impact on growth and investment. The second thing, which I mentioned just now, is around unemployment benefit reform. So the government said it's injecting, I think it's £1.3 billion into supporting unemployed people find work. So that's not just benefits, that's helping potentially for them to retrain, providing them with support, mental kind of health support, that kind of thing, and advice. So it's injecting money in trying to get people into work. It's also said that after 18 months, if people are unable to find work, they will be forced to undergo various policies the government's put in place. Those include things like retraining. So they will have to undergo retraining. And if after 6 months they are showing signs that they are unwilling to cooperate or have not committed to the process, then they can have their benefits cut at that point. So there's a kind of carrot and stick approach, both incentivizing but also threatening. And I think, that coupled with the cut to national insurance, which obviously makes work pay better, these are things that will incentivize work. They've been criticized, obviously, potentially for being cruel to some capacity, but for economic growth as a whole, I think this is a good step, probably, for getting more people back into work. And that's a key problem at the moment for the government and for the UK economy, as a whole, is that there are millions of people out of work who could work, up as many as 3 million, depending on what statistics people use at the moment. So there are two major positives, I think, for the economy going forward. Those are both long-term positives. The expensing issue, investment is something that is positive for the economy over time. Again, the impact on unemployment benefit reform is something that will be felt very much over time, because that threat is over 2 years. We're looking at medium term, long term. I think what's key to point out here, though, is that these effects are not transformative. So they are positive, sure, but I don't think they are transformative. The Institute of Fiscal Studies, for example, talked about the idea of full expensing being made permanent as a positive compared to not being made permanent. So greater certainty is good. But also the point here is that essentially the government is kind of subsidizing certain industries. So it's picking, those that use physical machinery and equipment and subsidizing them at the expense of other parts of the economy. The UK is a very services-based economy rather than manufacturing. So the effect on the broader economy is unlikely to be transformative. It's a subset of the economy that will receive this benefit, and the majority of the rest of the economy probably won't. So, or at least not to any meaningful extent. So I think that it's not a transformative change, from that perspective. And the unemployment reform is maybe useful, but it doesn't address the main issue at the moment in the UK economy, which is that millions of people are out of work, and the main cause of that, at least the main cause stated by the people out of work at the moment, is ill health. So there are long-term health issues, mental and physical health issues. It looks like those have been built up because of the coronavirus pandemic, either directly because of that or because the massive backlogs in healthcare, in NHS queues, mean that people can't be seen by doctors very quickly. And so we've got a big backlog of kind of long-term health issues that are unresolved. And I think for as long as we have that, the economy is going to really struggle to feel the impact of getting people back into work, the positive impact. It will be very piecemeal from the government's policy. And it's notable that in the Autumn Statement, the NHS normally receives big boosts in the Autumn Statement, tends to be something that is very popular with voters. This wasn't really a focus here, and there wasn't much said on that front. And I think that the point here politically is that this is an area that the government is really struggling to win support over. It said it would cut waiting lists for the NHS at the beginning of the year. It hasn't managed to do that. That was a pledge from the Prime Minister at the beginning of the year. He's now seems to have dropped that and has adopted other pledges, probably seeing that this is something that he's really struggling to succeed in doing. And so I think the idea of people being out of work having a major impact on the economy, that's something that is not just a medium term, but it's very much a long-term problem. So as I say, there are positive impacts here, but the key problems are probably still unresolved. So still major problems facing the economy. Next slide, please. And so, as I said, this is a very political Autumn Statement. The reason it's important is political. That election coming up, can the Conservatives turn it round, or is the Labour Party, who's now significantly in the lead and has been for a while, does this just confirm that it's on course for a majority victory? Well, I think there are some positives for the government to take away from this. The key thing is here, it has a selling point that it can campaign on now. It has cut taxes for business and for voters, and that's something that MPs who are very demoralised, frankly, from the Conservative Party, now have something that they can go to voters and say, look, we're on the right track. This is what we're doing. You can vote for us because we will continue to cut taxes. We've done the hard work. Now we're starting to, improve the situation for everyone. That's a kind of argument that you can campaign on, rightly or wrongly. Previously, there was very little, frankly, that the government could campaign on. And almost all of its resets, as I mentioned at the beginning, had kind of fallen apart. So in terms of for demoralised MPs and for voters who want to vote Conservative but haven't yet seen enough to be convinced, this is certainly a positive. It's a headline for them to use. We've cut taxes. As I said, it's the one thing that the Tory party agrees on. So it will add to unity for sure. I mean, Rishi Sunak was facing potential leadership contests over the government's immigration policy. That's likely to be put on the back burner, at least for now. His party unity for at least the next few months is probably ensured, based on the fact that he can say this is a government of cutting taxes, and you all agree with that. So the angry voices will be a bit quieter, I think, because of that. So definite positives on those two fronts. And I think the combination of tax cuts and welfare reform is a good dividing line for the Conservative government versus the Labour Party. So the Labour Party has been operating a very kind of fiscally conservative approach politically. That's the approach it's been taking with the election in mind, because it doesn't want to create a dividing line between the two parties. The Conservatives ideally would like to go into the election saying Labour Party wants to put up taxes to pay for greater welfare spending. And if they can do that, then there are lots of people out there who would think, well, I don't really like the Conservatives, but I don't really want to pay more tax. So that would be a great argument for them to run in the campaign. You can see that is desperate. They're desperately trying to push that. They've talked a lot, the Conservatives, in the last few days about Labour wanting to spend a lot more and therefore they're going to have to tax more. The Labour Party, obviously, to counter that, is saying that we won't spend more. They've been very fiscally conservative compared to what they would normally be saying in election campaigns. And so the cuts to taxes, maybe that's difficult for the Labour Party. I mean, in reality, they can go along with most of these tax cuts because, as I said, they're quite broad-based. They're very much pro taxes that will help businesses and will help voters, particularly in a cost of living crisis. The key thing here is that the Tories have combined it with welfare reform to unemployment benefits. And that's something the Labour Party will find much harder to pallet. This is much harder for it to sell to its base. And so there's a potential dividing line there. The Conservatives can go into the next election saying, we will cut taxes, and to pay for it, we will introduce welfare reform. The Labour Party would say, yeah, we want to cut taxes, but it will be much harder for them to say, we'll do it by cutting welfare spending. And therefore, it opens them up to that potential attack from the Conservatives about where the money's coming from. Next slide, please. I think it's just the last one. Yeah, okay. Sorry, the one before. Yeah, thanks. So there's positives for the Conservatives to take away, mainly just something for them to campaign on. I think they've got a strategy that could be formed around this autumn statement. Does it change the likely election result? I think, honestly, no, it doesn't. And there's a few key reasons for that. I think, I personally think a Labour majority is a big Labour majority is not as likely as people say. I think it's likely to be much smaller than people think. But a Labour majority government is certainly still the most likely outcome. I don't think this autumn statement particularly changes that. And there are a couple of reasons why. The main one is that if you look at the OBR, the Office of Budget Responsibilities forecasts on which this autumn statement was based, they're very, very negative, frankly. The forecasts have reduced the expectations for GDP growth for next year and the year after, but importantly for next year, they've been reduced to below 1%. So the outlook is very poor. And obviously going into an election campaign with the outlook of GDP growth at less than 1%, what your argument is that we've turned it around, we're now in a good place, now we can cut taxes, that's a very hard sell when the economy basically is stagnant, it's barely growing. And the second point here is perhaps equally as important, which is that the argument is that Conservatives have cut taxes, but the tax take to GDP, so the amount of tax people are paying, is still going up. And according to the OBR, will continue to go up this year, next year, the year after that, the year after that. And that's because the government has frozen tax thresholds and because inflation is relatively high. So, wages are going up, and that's pushing people into higher tax thresholds, and therefore they have to pay higher percentages of tax. And that's actually why the government has had the space to make these tax cuts in the first place. And so you're in a kind of a strange position where higher taxes is bringing in more money, which is allowing the government to cut taxes and say we've cut taxes. And it's this strange cyclical argument that has been noted, importantly here, has been noted not just by opponents of the government, but also by the right-wing press. So the Conservative supporting press, writers in that have commented on this today, and yesterday they did, that taxes, in theory, the tax take is still going up. So this is a kind of, it's a false argument by the government. And the fact that right-wing commentators are saying that is important because it means that the voters that the Conservatives are trying to appeal to are very much aware of this slightly false narrative. And also, just in terms of how much money people have, if the tax take is going up, the idea that people are feeling richer and because of tax cuts, it's unlikely to take hold in a meaningful way because the reality is people are still paying more in tax than they did last year. And I think that's a key point because during a cost of living crisis, the biggest fall in living standards for decades is still underway. We're in a position now where it's the actual impact, how rich people actually feel is the reason they might change their vote, rather than the headline of a particular tax cut. So I don't think this will have a a kind of meaningful change on the election landscape for that reason. The third point here is important as well, that if you look at the polls, the Conservatives are on low 20% in some polls, high 20% in other polls. The difference here is to what extent a Tory recovery is built in already. Those saying that the Conservatives are on 27, 28, 29% in the polls, if you look at the polling, what it shows is that they've already built in the idea that a lot of undecided voters, Conservative voters from 2019, that are still undecided, and there's a big chunk of those. These polls are already building in the fact that the majority of those voters will end up voting Conservative. And the impact of this Autumn statement is that a lot of those voters probably will now vote Conservative. The point being that a lot of polls have already built that in. That's already assumed. So what the Conservatives need to do to really change the outlook for the election is to win over voters from the other side, voters that have left the Conservatives and that now say they're going to vote for Labour, or more importantly, Reform UK, the kind of the new small party on the right of the Conservatives, that's taken over from the Brexit party that there was previously. A lot of Conservative voters from 2019, the last election, have said, or are saying at the moment, that they're going to vote for Reform, 10 to 15% in most polls, and maybe above that in some recent polls. The Conservatives need to win those voters back, and so basically, has this done enough to win those back? I think probably not, for the reasons I said above. In which case, the best polls that we have at the moment are probably a fair reflection of what will end up being the election result anyway, unless something else happens. So the Conservatives, I think, still need something bigger, something more, not just to win, but actually even just to deny the Labour Party a minority government. So if they get up to 32, 33% in the polls, they get to the level that makes it much more difficult for Labour to win a majority, which would be a kind of win for the Conservatives. They would also conserve a lot more of their seats. So there'll be a bigger bulk of MPs in Parliament. And so that would be, I think from where they are now, that might be even a relative victory. I still think we need to see much more for that to happen at this stage because of the nature of the polling. And the final thing is that immigration is now such a big issue for the Conservatives specifically, only for the Conservatives. If you look at the voters from 2019, so that if you look at the last election, the people who voted Conservative in that election, by far the two most important things for them in polling are immigration and the economy. Those are the things people are really concerned about. Those are the things that are going to make them change their vote. Tax cuts are useful on the economy, but again, it's whether people actually feel like the economy is getting better. Do they feel like they're actually getting richer? That's the thing that will change things. The other thing is immigration. Conservatives have not managed to get a handle on this. The immigration numbers actually came out today for the last year. They show immigration going up to 670 odd thousand people entering the country. That's over 3 times the amount the Conservatives were aiming for in their manifesto for 2019. And it's an increase on last year rather than a decrease. Given that this is such an important issue, the chances of the government sort of turning things around remain quite slim. And importantly, I mentioned Reform UK, the party to the right of the Conservatives. Immigration for voters in this party is really, really important, possibly the most important issue. Although polling is a bit vague on this, but it's possibly the most important issue. And so if the Conservatives are unable to turn that around, those voters that they really, really need to return to them just won't do so. So I think the election result at the moment looks unlikely to be turned on its head because of the Autumn statement. It was a political statement. It did provide support for both business and voters, to its credit, to Hunt's credit there. But I don't think it did enough to dramatically change the political landscape. And that's really what matters, because without that, in a year's time, we will have a different party in government. The Labour Party will be in government, and we will have potentially a different set of government policies. So I'll leave it there for now, and we can head into a Q&A.
Lovely, thank you very much, Nika. That was very, very insightful. As Nika mentioned, we do have time for a Q&A now. Please do feel free to pop any questions into the Q&A function, which will either appear at the top or at the bottom of your screen. I do have a question already to get things started, Nika. So it's, You mentioned how the Autumn Statement has targeted businesses and voters. How has it been received by both of those so far?
Yeah, so I think that the important thing here is, well, there are two things. So businesses and voters. In terms of business, this has been received pretty well so far. The CBI, so the kind of in business industry lobby group, has been quite pleased, particularly with that expensing issue. So the full expensing of capital for them has been a massive positive and something they've kind of been campaigning for a while. So there are segments of business that are really happy with this, I think, and would say it was a very pro-business autumn statement. As I said, it doesn't appeal necessarily to the broad segment of the economy, and so there are plenty of elements of the business sector that have commented on it, kind of saying it. You know, it's a step in the right direction, but it's not really offered that much for them. So narrowly, I guess, in terms of the economy and business, it has been received very well. Other parts of the economy less so, I guess, inevitably. And in terms of voters, we haven't had any polling out, obviously, yet, so we can't tell whether voters really are enthused by this or not. But I think the key thing here is to look at the kind of major commentators that drive political opinion, and also the major media organizations that drive political opinion. What is interesting is that that GB News, for example, the media organization that targets really the right of the political spectrum, there have been commentators on GB News saying that they believe that basically the government's trying to pull the wool over people's eyes here, and that the fact that the tax take as a percentage of GDP continues to go up means that it's basically the government is still lying to them about the fact that it's cutting tax. You know, so that different dynamic from the kind of right wing elements of the media, which I think will have an impact on voters, is really important, and suggests that basically what it suggests is that the government has lost the trust of a big section of society, of its own voters, particularly on the right of the party, and that those voters will not be convinced by the government trying to sell itself. It's not announcements like this, you know, that will lead them to change their mind. As I said, for them, what would change their mind is an actual improvement in their lives, maybe. They're much more skeptical, clearly, from this commentary about what the government's doing. So I would argue that in terms of how it's been received well from core Conservative voters, particularly the kind of centre of the party, centre left, centre right of the party, received it very well. But on the right of the party, which is going to be really important for the Conservatives' election chances, because if they lose that element of the party to Reform UK, they're in for a really, really tough election campaign. On that bit of the party, you look at what commentators are saying, what news organisations are saying, it's not really had the impact that the government would have wanted, I think.
Okay. Thank you, Nico. Another one we've had through is, do you think that the national insurance tax cuts are likely to attract foreign workers as well?
Yeah, this is an interesting one, because I think one of the impacts of Brexit on the UK in the immediate aftermath was there was a whole load of labour shortages in key sectors on which there had been a reliance on European workers. And so the need to attract foreign workers is really important for the functioning economy. Do I think it will help attract foreign workers? It's certainly a positive, yes. I think it's something that should presumably help attract foreign workers. And I think actually it's important to note here that the government, I mentioned immigration as a really important policy for the Conservatives. What the Office of Budget Responsibility, the forecasts it's making, on which the Autumn Statement has been sort of built around, those forecasts are suggesting that a lot of the economic growth that the government is envisaging over the next 2 or 3 years is built on the fact that immigration is driving it. So the number of people coming here to work is increasing, and that is helping to sustain economic growth. And so the government is caught in this strange bind of having to potentially crack down on immigration for the sake of its own voters, but also really it needs to increase immigration to allow it more fiscal space to make the tax cuts it's needed. And so that means, I think, in general, the government actually is going to be quite open over the next year to, facilitating more immigration, to increase immigration for working people to try and fill job vacancies. So I think the combination of that and a cut to national insurance is probably a positive for attracting foreign workers. Yeah, I'd say so.
Thank you. Another one is, do you think Labour will reverse any of these changes should they win the election, like the national insurance reduction?
I think I mentioned that Labour is looking at running a campaign basically on fiscal conservatism, and by that I mean basically mirroring exactly what the Conservatives are doing to avoid having this divide opening up that might cost them the election. They don't want to be seen as a party that's going to increase spending and taxes, and therefore, basically, people don't want to vote for a party that's going to increase taxes. That's their concern. And I think what that means is that heading into the election, the Labour Party will say that it will mirror pretty much all of these policies, I would guess. It might take some issue with the way the unemployment benefit reform has been modelled. It might say it's unfair in some capacity, but I think, on the whole, it will basically keep that in place, maybe with some tweaks. National insurance cut, I think it will say, yeah, we'll keep that because that's a benefit to voters and workers. And I think the full expensing issue, which, it could be so important, Labour will definitely keep that in place. That's something, as I said, that Rachel Reeves, the Shadow Chancellor, has been pushing for anyway, and has said yesterday that she supported and thought was a good idea. So I think the Labour Party will keep these policies in place as an election pledge going into the election for political reasons. And I think in government, it will not look to reverse them. The issue here is that what the Conservative government has done is it's used up all of the fiscal space that there is available. So the fiscal planning for the government is over a 5-year period. All the fiscal space in that 5-year period has been used up on this autumn statement to allow some tax cuts. That means there's basically no space to do anything over the next 4 years. And the forecasts are dependent on increasing fuel duty, which I don't think either the Labour Party or the Conservatives are realistically going to do. Make fuel more expensive seems unlikely. So whoever wins the next election is going to face a very, very tight fiscal environment. And I think the Labour Party ultimately, a couple of years in, is going to have to start increasing taxes. The Conservative Party probably would also have to do the same, but the Labour Party more likely to do so because it will be under greater pressure to increase spending for public sector wages and also for green investment, key pledge that it's looking for. So there will be some tax increases, not immediately, but I think there will be after maybe 18 months, 2 years under a Labour government. Most likely for capital gains tax, by the way. I think that's the most likely area. Yeah.
Thank you, Nico. We've had through, do you think that the tax duty or inheritance tax cuts will be included in the spring statement?
I think, as I mentioned, the stamp duty, so that's the threshold for house earnings or house sales, and then inheritance tax. I think those are things that the government probably still wants to do. And if there is any space in the spring budget, I think stamp duty is something that the threshold will be lifted on that as a kind of pre-election gift to homeowners who tend to vote Conservative. I think the inheritance tax issue is something that the Conservatives will include as a manifesto pledge for the election. I think heading into that election, that is something they will promise to do without actually implementing beforehand. And the reason for that is basically because, as I said, there's not a lot of fiscal space to do more tax cuts. Maybe there will be a bit more by spring, but probably not that much. So tax cuts have to be targeted. There's only so many they can do. Inheritance tax is something they can just promise, and it's potentially useful because the Labour Party, I think, will oppose that one. It targets only the top few percent of the population. And so I think the Labour Party will be comfortable saying that's one that we will not implement. And actually use it to attack the Conservatives. So for the Conservatives, they don't need to implement it beforehand. They can use that only as an election promise, knowing that the Labour Party will oppose it, and therefore the political divide between them will be there in the election. If that makes sense.
You did just mention the spring statement, of course, but another question that's come through is there another budget before the election? and what else
Yeah.
can we announce if everything has been used already?
So there will be a budget in March. It tends to be in March, so there'll be a spring budget that will outline the plans for the next year. Obviously, with an election coming up, that will be a plan to get voters to vote for the Conservatives only, pretty much. I mentioned the different time periods there could be an election. May is one of the times people think there might be an election, depending if the Conservatives have recovered in the polls a bit by then. I think October is more likely. January the year after is another one. But either way, there's not much time between that spring budget and the next election. There won't be we're not going to see huge changes to the economy in that spring budget. Basically, if there is any space, there will be a small giveaway to potential Conservative voters. That will be the thing they target. Stamp duty is something I mentioned for homeowners. That's the kind of thing we might see.
And again, tax has been mentioned throughout, but is the tax pressure for employees going to increase or decrease after this statement?
Yeah, okay. So the amount of tax employees are paying, obviously the cut to it. So it depends how much you're earning. The national insurance cut particularly will benefit those earning less than £50,000 a year. But I think the important point is that I mentioned that the overall tax to GDP take is increasing anyway, regardless of this budget. And the reason it's increasing is because the thresholds of tax. So the £50,000 is the level at which you pay. Beyond that, you pay a higher level of tax, etc. Those thresholds have been frozen, and the government's plan is to keep them frozen for the next few years. That freezing will outweigh, in terms of how much tax voters are paying, workers are paying. That will outweigh the cut in national insurance for most people, because wage growth now is about 6-7% at the moment. That's pushing more and more people above the tax thresholds that mean they have to pay more tax. So overall, people will still probably end up having to pay more tax, at least over the next year or two, definitely over the next 2 or 3 years if this plan stays in place, even with this national insurance tax cut.
I think a nice question to end, unless we get another one through, is it seems it won't make a Conservative election victory more likely. Is there anything else, I guess, other than what you've mentioned already, between now and then, or now and the next election, that could?
I think there are 3 things that could turn the election in the Conservatives, maybe not in their favour, but kind of transform the outlook. I said that Labour majority government, or Labour government, certainly Labour majority probably is fairly nailed on. In fact, I give the Conservatives less than 10% chance of winning the election, so very, very small. But I think there are 3 things to watch. One is the combination of a range of economic indicators. If we see inflation fall much further, so it's at 4.8% now, 4.6% I think it is now. If we see it fall quickly now next year down to 2% or less, we see wage growth continue to be really strong, and we see the economy start to pick up in a way that's not expected by any forecasters, really. Then there will be a very strong argument for the Conservatives to say, we have actually managed the economy quite well. So they need multiple indicators to turn all at the same time in their favour. If they do that, then the government, that's something the government can run on. At the same time, they would need a resolution to the Rwanda immigration policy that I mentioned. They would need to have something turn in their favour on that front, which doesn't look likely before the election, because everything they're trying is held up in the courts, which delays it for months and months on end. So they would need something to turn for them, I think, on all of those things I mentioned. And if that happens, they'll have a slightly better chance, but it's unlikely.
Okay. Well, thank you, Nico. That makes perfect sense. We haven't had any other questions come through, and I'll just move this slide there. We haven't had any more questions come through, so we'll wrap up there. But just to say thank you ever so much on behalf of the Chamber. As everyone can see, we do have the contact details for Nico and Stefan as well, who is the country manager at Signum Global. Should you have any further questions, please do feel free to contact them both directly, and there will be a follow-up email after the session as well, including their contact details. So I'm very much encourage you to get in touch with them directly to ask any further questions. It's also just worth reiterating that Signum not only provides this research, but they do also hold access events. So if you'd like to learn more about those as well, again, Nico and Stefan can give you some information on that. And yeah, just a big thanks again, Nico and the Signum team for collaborating with us. Thank you to all of those who have joined us as well. And please do keep an eye on our events calendar. We have a few important events coming up between now and the end of the year, and most notably the barometer on the climate and outlook for Spanish investment in the UK event, which will take place at the Embassy of Spain on the 13th of December. Information on all of our upcoming events are on our website, and we've also started to announce some of the events coming up in January as well. So it's set to be a very busy end of year and start of the new year as well. That's everything from me. Nico, unless you have anything else to share,
No, thanks for having me.
Thank you, Nico. Everyone, I hope you have a lovely day, and thanks again.